So you've got an organization, and perhaps you meet face to face a lot, or you have hackathons or things like that. But you have a need to work with your organization outside of the times when you're able to meet. How do you do that? The short answer, the TLDR, is that you do it using GitHub. So this presentation is all about how to run your organization using GitHub. I'm Hector. My handle is Hector Sector. I'm a trainer for the GitHub Professional Services team. I am based out of Orlando, Florida, in the US. And in my spare time, I like to visit theme parks, as you might expect, living in Orlando. My background is I did a lot of work in higher ed. I've taught programming courses, and I've also designed curriculum for programming courses and math courses. And before that, I was getting my master's degree in computer engineering at the University of Central Florida. So here's the basics of what we're going to cover. We're going to learn how to manage teams of people, how to communicate effectively, and how to get on the same page. So let's first talk about managing teams of people. This section right here is mostly going to be on the technical aspect of managing those teams of people on GitHub. So you're probably used to working with a personal repository on GitHub. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to highlight the two types of ownership that are possible using GitHub repositories. So on the left, you see what you may already be familiar with, which is a personal account. And on the right, you see an organizational account. Both of these are possible on GitHub, and both of these can have repositories associated with them. There are some big differences between the personal and the organizational, though. So with a personal account, when you have a repository that's owned by an individual, you can only invite collaborators to that repository, which is challenging if you're working in a team, because then you might have, let's say, a group of like 5 to 10 collaborators, for example, and then as people enter and leave your team or enter and leave your organization or your group, it's kind of hard to maintain that. And then if you have more than one repository that these folks are collaborating on, that becomes a bit of a nightmare. So the solution to that is to use an organization. In an organization, you invite individuals to the organization, you group them into teams, and then you give them access to the repositories that they need access to using those teams. Also, with a personal repository, you only have really two permission levels. You're either an owner of the project or you're a collaborator. Collaborator has has a very limited role in terms of they can't do things like delete the repository, for example. Whereas in an organizational model, the teams themselves can have read, write, or admin permissions to specific repositories. So I could, for example, have read permission to a repository that another team is working on, and I can have admin permissions to those projects that are near and dear to my heart. With a personal account, there is only that one admin, as I mentioned, the owner of the repository. With an organizational account, you can toggle that admin setting for the team so that multiple people can be admins. Now, both the personal and the organizational repositories, with those accounts, you're able to do public repos and collaborators, add as many of those as you like. When you are a member of a team, so you first have to be invited to the organization. So here's an example of the Campus Expert organization. And both Joe and myself are members of the Campus Expert organization. And that's enough for me to have access to the repositories that are public within that organization. But if for some reason I also needed to be able to access particular repositories, maybe have access to a subset, or have admin access to a subset of those repositories, for example, I could be a part of a, say, facilitator team. And Joe could be a part of that team with me, but then Joe could also be a member of the reviewers team. And so each of these teams would probably have different access levels for different repositories. And you can use nested teams when you need finer grained control over exactly who is a member of which team. And when your organization gets large enough, when there's parent teams and child teams as well. This is a screenshot of what it looks like to give a team access to a particular repo along with their access level. So using this feature right here, any members of the training team are automatically going to get admin access to this TeacherBot repository. That makes it very easy because I don't need to manage membership for this repository by individuals. I can do it using the teams. Some recommendations that we've seen work for groups that are using GitHub to run their organization is to stick with a single organization. It may be attractive, the idea of maybe different organizations for different projects, or maybe different organizations for different initiatives. But the more organizations you have, the more complexity you add to the whole issue, and so it means that your teams won't carry over from organization to organization. So all that benefit that I just described about organizing people into teams now goes out the window because you have to manage that separately in each of the organizations. Their organizations are fully self-contained units, so they do not talk to one another in any way. So the more you can stick to a single organization, the easier your workflow is going to be. You can manage the repositories within that organization by making them private or public, and then by assigning people to teams and then granting those teams access to the repositories. There's also no need to fork, and I mentioned this because if you're coming from an open source world, for example, you're likely going to be used to a workflow that requires you to fork. If you're hosting a group that you manage on GitHub, it's a lot easier to grant access via teams and collaborators and allow people the ability to create their own branches and merge pull requests and close pull requests. And you might wonder, oh my gosh, but if I do that, what's going to happen? It's going to be chaos. And I think what you'll realize is that it won't be chaos if you take a little time to just write some guidelines out for your community and what they should do when they gain access, right? But you really want to foster that creative vision and that freedom for people to create branches and contribute and all that sort of good stuff. And just removing the forking aspect just takes one extra step out of the equation. Now, you can still fork maybe for members of the rest of the community, members that are not part of your organization. You can still have a forking workflow, but for the folks that are a part of your organization, think about whether you really need forking to begin with. Allow the people within your organization to create ad hoc teams. So this means that you can create teams for all sorts of things. So these examples here are based on how much of GitHub is using teams. So we have an all employees team, which all employees are a part of. We have teams that are project specific and they're meant to be torn down when a specific project is over. We have teams dealing with people's geographic location. So I'm part of a Southeast US team, for example. I believe I'm also part of a Florida team. Do teams allow people to create teams that allow them to identify with a special interest, maybe Blade Runner lovers or something like that, as well as teams that align with certain affinity groups. So, for example, we have a Black Toe Cats team, we have a Latinx team at GitHub. So there's many different ways in which people can organize themselves, allow people that freedom. It'll make it much easier to manage conversations across these groups of people, and it'll make it more interconnected. Now that we talked a little bit about how you manage the people themselves, once you've got the people in place, what are some good practices for communicating and how do you do so effectively? So that's what we'll talk about in this section. And the first thing I want to kind of kick it off with is that the right tool for the job is really important for you to pick. So, for example, if you have a pressing issue, for example, you have something that needs to be fixed relatively quickly, like maybe within the hour. Perhaps for that, a pull request comment doesn't make sense, or an issue comment doesn't make sense, right? Because it has some urgency to it. So maybe that's a scenario where you check if somebody's online on Slack and you send them a message, or you mention them as maybe to the entire channel, or you schedule a quick Skype sync up with somebody face to face because it's that important of an issue, right? However, if something really doesn't require immediate attention, there is a huge case to be made for the fact that you should be doing that work on issues and pull requests. So those are appropriate formats for things that have to do with your projects themselves. And oftentimes, don't underestimate the power of a face-to-face meeting. So if you're leading a group that has a geographical component to it, then meeting face-to-face is sometimes the best solution. But again, just because you've always met face-to-face, if you're part of that group, doesn't mean that that's the only way you should continue to do the work, because that means that people have to take time out of their lives to meet, and when people don't show up, well, what happens? They need to be able to be caught up, or they feel left out. So even when you do meet in person, back it up with some sort of written record of that. So I propose to you that you communicate differently if you're managing your organization on GitHub. You focus on inclusive communication. So rather than forcing people to be there at that example that I just mentioned of a face-to-face meeting, be inclusive. Realize that some people may not be able to come to a face-to-face meeting, and so what do you do for them? Maybe you jot some notes down in an issue. That's an example of something you can do. Rely on async communication. Working face-to-face and synchronously is awesome, but not everybody works well synchronously. There are folks, myself included, that thrive asynchronously. I love doing most of my work asynchronously. So rely on async communication as a backup even when you do use synchronous communication. And as a record of what you talked about. Write everything down. If you believe something strongly enough, you put a URL on it, and that's what we do at GitHub. No conversation happens really that doesn't have an issue or a pull request backing it up. And also craft your communication for your future selves. Think about how your team is going to evolve. Think about how your projects are going to change over time, and write documentation, write steps down so that you make your life easier in the future. Some things to keep in mind anytime that you have a message is to think about the delivery method. So that goes back to using the right tool for the right job that I discussed a little earlier. Is an issue the right thing? Is it a Slack message? Is it a face-to-face? Is it a Skype call? Is it if you're actually contributing work, do it via a pull request. Maybe it doesn't need an issue to start it with. A pull request is the right delivery method for that. Think about the type of content that you're developing. Is this good for written? Maybe it's a video. Think about the audience, and more importantly, not only your audience, but the investment that audience needs to spend on what it is that you're writing. Oftentimes, you may be rewriting something for consumption within your immediate group, and so you can make some assumptions, but what if you could take the same exact documentation and write it in a way where an open source contributor could also pick it up and use it, right? So think about that as well. And finally, think about using visuals. If you're not familiar with Markdown, become familiar with it. Use Markdown to style your text, use emoji liberally, use images and Markdown tables to make sure that your point gets across. Here's just a couple of quick suggestions of things that we find works for us when we communicate asynchronously. And sometimes synchronously. So the first thing is include a TLDR. We include a TLDR usually at the top of every post or at the bottom of the post. If you're not familiar, TLDR stands for either, which depends which one you subscribe to, too long didn't read or too lazy didn't read. And it's just a quick, 1-2 sentence summary of what the entire post is doing. So here's an example of Cynthia writing a TLDR for an issue that's a little bit longer than that. Identify the scope of your ship. So I did this here in this issue where I was doing something pretty quickly, something that wouldn't affect a lot of other systems, wouldn't change much. It would just make life easier for users. So I kind of said I can ship this with 1 thumbs up. That's all I needed. If instead maybe I'm changing the way that our team does something, or I'm changing a policy or a procedure, what I would do at that point is I would say, I will not ship this until I have everybody's thumbs up, right? So think about the scope of the change you're proposing and be explicit about identifying that in your pull requests. We love taking quick polls using emoji reactions. So if you need to get a feel for your community and what they're thinking, their opinion about a certain issue, consider throwing up a poll with a simple issue comment and asking people to upvote or downvote or use whatever emoji is appropriate for each of the choices. And finally, you probably know this by now, but convey your tone with emoji. When you talk asynchronously, one of the things that you lose is the ability to add all that color that we add with spoken language, right? We're able to, I'm talking to you right now, and you can either tell that I'm excited or that I'm sad because you hear the sound of my voice. You lose a lot of that. You lose that tone when you're writing. So use emoji liberally to help you convey your tone. Here's an example of Steve Winton. He's in the professional services team with me, and I can tell from reading this example that he is eager to help, and that he gave me a time estimate. He's excited to work on it. Those are all things that I can kind of gather from just reading this. And finally, enslaved to synthetics, right? We've got a picture of Probot up in the top right. If you're not familiar with Probot, it's a GitHub app that lets you leverage the GitHub API to do really cool things on GitHub. There's a bunch of Probot plugins out there, and it's just the beginning, so you can contribute to Probot yourself. But I'm also showing you here two examples of Hubot in particular, and how we leverage Hubot within GitHub, and how you can do that too within your organization. So the top example is Hubot commenting on an issue after we've linked that issue from a Slack channel. So if I'm on Slack and in the services training channel, I'm trying to reference an issue, Hubot will automatically drop a note in the issue with a link to that conversation. That's important because often, because of these disjointed ways of communicating that we talked about, you saw a lot of logos out there when I said all the ways we talk at GitHub. So Hubot just kind of helps us bridge that gap. And then on the bottom is an example of Hubot doing the inverse, which is Hubot reporting back to us on Slack when somebody has committed something, or when somebody's opened a pull request and all that other sort of good stuff. So Hubot kind of sits in our Slack channel, and he listens, and he gives us useful information as well. All right, so after you've organized your people into teams and you have a good communication strategy, how do you actually get work done? How do you get on the same page to get work done? So that's what this section is about here. So I recommend you establish some patterns with your group of folks, right? Whatever that pattern might be for you. At GitHub, we actually employ all of these over here. So weekly radars, this is an issue we open up in our team repositories of what we are up to during the week, what we've got in the pipeline. If anybody needs help or is stuck on something, they use the weekly radar to tell that to other folks on the team. If somebody's reading something interesting, they also drop a note on the radar. And people sometimes have nice or heated conversations about some of the topics on the radar. Have regular stand-ups, and this can be synchronous, so this can be on Skype or Zoom, Google Hangouts, whatever it may be. Or sometimes we've done async stand-ups as well, where we just kind of sit on the Slack channel at the same time and we go over some of the topics. Async stand-ups are nice when, for example, some of us are out or traveling. Use projects. So projects on GitHub is a feature that allows you to create boards and then move issues and PRs and notes between those boards. So projects are a great way to track your work. They're also extremely diverse, which I'll show you in a few minutes. So they allow you to really be flexible about the way in which you track your projects. It's a lightweight project management tool. And when you create issues, include a checklist on them. This tells everybody in your group how they can contribute and what they can jump into right away, and it also gives you a nice bird's eye view of what's left to be done for your team. This is an example of an issue template, which I would recommend you use if you haven't already been using them in your organization. So an issue template tells anybody that opens a new issue exactly what they should be using or writing about in the issue. So this is for our training kit repository, which hosts the on-demand training that you may have seen by now. And so what we ask people to do is include screenshots if they find a bug, if they're trying to fix something, to include some reasoning about it. And then we give them a step-by-step list of how they can contribute. There's a high likelihood that you're going to have to do some brainstorming. And it's great if you can do a brainstorming session face-to-face, but sometimes it actually is even nicer to be able to do one on GitHub. So try using an issue or a pull request for a brainstorming session. This allows people to chime in during the time that they feel they are most creative and productive, right? So I do a lot of good work in the morning and late at night. I do not do good work in the middle of the day. So if there's an ideation phase, a brainstorming phase, I'm not going to do that in the middle of the day because I'm not great at thinking through things in the middle of the day. So I'll leave that for the morning. Now, if I was stuck in a room with a group full of people and at 3 p.m. it was time to do some brainstorming, I kind of have no choice. But the ideas you get out of me might be very different from the ideas you would get out of me in an issue or a pull request. Another recommendation is that, again, that TLDR, you include a TLDR at the very top, and you state what the problem is and ask for input so that people know what they're brainstorming for, the reason they're brainstorming for. Before you submit an idea or something, or you start trying to do a little bit of ideation, do a little bit of research and cross-link past issues, past conversations that have happened, maybe research that's happened online for your teammates so that they don't have to do that themselves. And then include a very direct line that tells people how they can contribute in under 5 minutes. And finally, be explicit about the purpose and when the ideation phase will be complete. But talking about doing the work itself, it's important for the entire group to follow one way of doing work. And so our recommended way of doing work is using the GitHub flow. If you haven't heard of the GitHub flow by now, it's this idea that all the work that's live, all the work that's already your team has all agreed on, lives on the master branch, right? And this can be a software project, or this can just be like your group's charter. It doesn't need to be code necessarily. Everything can be kept on GitHub. So your master branch contains live code or the version of the documents that everybody's already agreed on. When it comes time to change something, you always do it on a branch. So you create a branch off a master, and then once that branch is created, you add some commits to that branch. Commits are like snapshots. If you've gone through the Git module already, this is probably sounding a little bit familiar, right? At some point, you're going to want to talk to your teammates about it, so you do that via a pull request. And the pull request is really the place where you should have heated discussions about the direction that your branch is going in. Furthermore, it should not be the end of the commits. In fact, that should make way for additional commits, maybe commits authored by not the original author, but all the teammates. And so this means that people are not so attached to their work that they're not willing to listen to what other folks are willing to say or what they're willing to bring to the table. And the whole reason you want to do your work on GitHub is so that you rely on other people for ideas and you have a diverse group of opinions. This is the deploy step. So if we're talking about a software project, for example, this would be the stage at which you could deploy from your branch to an environment and have folks test it out. And the last step of the GitHub flow is merging, which is where the work that's happened on the branch becomes live by being merged in with the master branch. I bring the GitHub flow up during this part of the conversation because folks come from all sorts of different backgrounds. And going back to being inclusive about the way you're doing work, it's important that you train people on a common way of work. So training people across the board to use the GitHub flow is going to pay off in the end. If you do implement the GitHub flow or whatever workflow you end up implementing, you can protect your master branch, for example, from people force pushing to it or from people committing to it directly. You can require pull request reviews from individuals, or you could even leverage our one of our newer features, code owners, to alert specific people that are in charge of specific portions of the code. I mentioned that there's a lot of ways to use project boards, so here are some flexible ways to use project boards. So the top example is how the training team does it, which is we specify what's shipping every month. And so every time we open a new issue or a new pull request, if it's on our roadmap, we'll drop that issue or pull request on the proper column of the project board, depending on when that particular project is shipping. Some teams don't like that. Some teams prefer to use something that's happening within the next 60, 30 days, 7 days, or thinking about the things that have already been launched and just putting them into that board. Some teams would rather keep track of a backlog, what's in progress, what's done, what's coming up next. And then some teams identify their milestone, for example, or something that is just in the icebox for a while. So hopefully this is a good run through of how to run an organization using GitHub. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask.